another element of what's going on in the present in our COVID-19 environment, emergency savings and 401k's role. I'll let our moderator, Katie Taylor, who is Vice President of Thought Leadership at Fidelity Investments, introduce the panel. But I do want to remind everyone that there's a couple different ways that you can ask questions. One is in the chat box during the session, and the other is you could raise your hand at the end of the session, and we will unmute you and let you ask your question directly to the panelists. So with that, I will turn it over to Katie.
Thanks so much, Lori. I'm thrilled to be here and happy to have this great panel of experts here with me. During this session, we'd like to focus some time on the emergency savings landscape, which will also include the role of the 401k and other solutions that can help people during times of need. So, you know, when we think about the last session and sort of the longer term impacts to retirement savings, what we want to focus on here is, you know, what can be done in the near term to sort of help people, you know, especially when you think about the CARES Act, you know, maybe avoid, you know, taking money out of their retirement account to the extent that they can. So I'm joined by 3 experts today to help us unpack some of those solutions and data and insights. And I'll start with Catherine Harvey. She's a senior policy advisor at the AARP Public Policy Institute. In her role, Catherine develops public policy and market solutions to help people weather financial challenges and achieve their goals. She's dedicated to restoring the link between hard work and financial security in today's changing economy. Also joined by Sid Pila, who is the founder and CEO of the Sunny Day Fund, an emergency and personal savings platform delivered as a worker benefit with gamified company matching. Sid and his team are taking on the savings challenge in America from tech, business, and policy perspectives, driven by their own personal experiences with financial hardships. Barb Hogue is a partner with the retirement practice at Aon. She has over 30 years of experience and is a retirement consultant focusing on a broad range of retirement issues, including detailed plan design, retirement readiness, and participant communication. She's also involved in retirement thought leadership efforts to identify trends in retirement program design. So thank you all for joining this morning and participating in the panel discussion. To get us started, I actually wanted to just take a minute to share some information that Fidelity, you know, that myself and my team have been working on compiling sort of the impact of the CARES Act distribution and loan provisions within 401k plans. Thought this might be a good jumping off point. So if we go to the next slide, this is sort of a lot of information on the slide, but as you take a minute to sort of take a look at what's going on here, I just wanted to call out a few things before we get into our first sort of Q&A, and that is certainly within Fidelity, and I'm sure other providers, we have definitely seen, you know, throughout the past couple of months, participants within 401k and 403b plans reaching out, wanting to understand what options they have for leveraging funds within their retirement accounts. And once the CARES Act, you know, was passed and that option was available, we have seen people taking advantage of that. So I'll just call out a couple of quick things, and that is, number one, when you think about the overall universe of defined contribution plans, we're still seeing that a relatively small percent of folks are actually leveraging these options. So you can see in that first bullet on the left, 3% of participants have opted to take advantage of the CARES Act distribution. When I look at overall money out trends, you know, between April and June of, say, last year or even in years prior, we actually haven't seen a huge increase in the overall trends of money out. But what I'll note is that, you know, the median distribution amount, you can see that here, is $4,800. You know, I think that what's happening here is that people who are taking advantage of this option are really doing so because they don't have any other way to access liquid, money that they need, whether they are dealing with, a layoff or a furlough, or perhaps someone is ill in their house and they need access to money. And they're really, really leveraging this option, likely because they have an immediate need for money and they don't have any other way to get it, because maybe they don't have, a rainy day fund or an emergency account. So I just wanted to share that information to get us started. And, what I'd like to first do is maybe turn it over to Barb to lead off, to sort of carry that theme in terms of how much are we seeing people use their 401ks as an emergency savings vehicle during this crisis? And maybe, Barb, I'll invite you to sort of give a little bit more commentary on that topic.
Yeah, so thank you. Hopefully you can all hear me. Before we dig specifically into that question about the 401k, I kind of wanted to go back to pre-COVID and think about where employees were. So a little less than 2 years ago, we did an employee survey and ask a whole broad array of questions. Now, to acknowledge, this survey was full-time employees at various employers, but what we found was rather staggering, that would say people really are not prepared for emergencies, right? 43% of people said they were just getting by financially. So I think about that number, that was pre-COVID. And then some of the statistics Karen just offered in the first panel from the Prudential survey about how people are feeling with the COVID crunch, tells me those folks clearly are not prepared for what's happened to them subsequently. So it's a rather staggering number, especially when we layer COVID on top of that. The other thing that's really important to think about, as we say, where were employees before the crisis? There's a lot of consumer debt out there, right? We found that 1 out of every 2 people, obviously more in the lower pays, but it was across the full range. We found 1 out of 2 carried credit card debt. And when I say credit card debt, it's carried each month, not paid off each month. So that's a pretty staggering number, where we find people are heavily relying on credit. Now, you could argue maybe a few people are using this strategically for cash flow and other stuff, but the fact of the matter is people are carrying a lot of consumer debt there. I think the number that shocked me actually the most, while at some level you might say it's not that big, but if you think of the reality of it, it was the use of payday loans. 1 out of 20 people are using payday loans on a fairly regular basis. And that is really staggering when you think of the cost of that debt and what that means for people. So this is all kind of pre-COVID. And so kind of put that up. I think we've all heard the Federal Reserve number that 40% of Americans couldn't find $400 in cash. When I see these numbers, I get it. Now, we did ask a similar question, and we found people, if they were struck with an emergency, we asked something about, could you find $1,000? But we didn't put some of the caveats that the Federal Reserve had. And so, their study did say without going into debt, et cetera. We didn't put those caveats. And 75% of people said they could find that. Now, again, in their favor is their full-time employees, right? But also they might use debt. And based on the numbers we see here, my guess is that's how they would find it. So kind of that's all pre-COVID. Now we go into some of the COVID experiences that Katie shared, and that to me is really telling. We had also conducted a survey of record keepers, but it only kind of had data up through April, and at that point we're seeing a little less than 1% were using a COVID distribution. What we just saw from Katie is that number is up to 3% after 3 months. So that is showing a fairly heavy reliance, and I would concur with what Katie said, probably heavily relying on that is their source of funds. And so when you think about that 3%, I also kind of look at that compared to average hardship withdrawals, because in a way this is a glorified hardship withdrawal. If you have a COVID thing, a COVID condition, you're a qualified individual, you can take this distribution if it's offered. When you think of hardships in a plan, you might see 2, 3, maybe 4% of people annually using a hardship. So let's just go with that 3% number. In 3 months, we have doubled kind of doubled that just with the coronavirus distributions. So what I think we're seeing is kind of back to my original premise. People weren't really prepared for an emergency. We now had the COVID crisis. Tie that with some of the prudential numbers that Karen offered in the first discussion, and people are heavily relying on their 401k. Now, the loans, we don't see quite as much in that. But again, recognize people were heavily using their loans anyway. It was not uncommon to see 1 out of 5 people dipping into their savings, sometimes very regularly, to help cover their expenses as well. So if we think about it, the 401k was pretty heavily used to cover some short-term expenses, and now we're seeing a pretty big increase in that with some of the COVID distributions relative to what we saw before. And again, not surprising when you think about where people were prepared for an emergency. On the right, just I want to reiterate some of the things Jack said. So I'm going to go through this fast, and Jack already did a very thorough discussion. But I just want to say those things, those decisions people make in light of the crisis can be pretty big when we think of the long term. And so these are illustrations as opposed to Jack's robust analysis about what it means overall. But every few years, Aon will do what we call a retirement income adequacy study. We call it the real deal. And what we did, we used that methodology to just work on an illustration that says what happens to a person that does one of 2 things. One was, what if they stop saving to get through this crisis? And in this scenario, we said they stopped for a year and then gradually increased to a pre-COVID savings rate of 7% with a 1% bump a year. Just an illustration, gives you something to go. And then we also said, if on top of that, they take a COVID distribution. And the numbers here on the right side of the screen are telling you what that means, either in terms of how much they're going to need to delay their retirement because of those actions, or how much they need to reduce their standard of living. So the delay retirement is 1 or 2 years. The reduce the standard of living is kind of shocking to me, again, when you think of reducing your standard of living 5% versus 9%. Our whole analysis assumes people want to maintain their pre-retirement standard of living. Given 43% of people are just getting by financially, we then on top of that say you might need to reduce your standard of living by 5% or 9% in these scenarios. That is pretty dramatic. So I think what we're seeing, people don't have many choices. When we look at where they were financially, they are looking to their 401k to help them through that. So the 401k is a source, along with consumer debt, to help them get by. And the result is they might be getting by now. Might be. We don't know how long this crisis lasts, but they're getting by now, but it is going to have huge detrimental effects in the long term for those individuals that are working through this. So that's kind of, when we look at the 401k and emergency savings, that's some of the thoughts we have on that. So Katie, I think I'm going to turn it back to you now, if that's okay.
Yeah, that's great. And thank you for that. And just to build on that, Sid, why don't I ask you, when you think about consumers, what type of emergency savings are they asking for? And so maybe that's a good sort of follow-up to Barb's comments here.
Yeah, absolutely. We can start diving into more so the liquid side of the house now. So just to build on what Barb was just talking about in terms of the amount of assets people have, early April, just as COVID was, we were starting to realize the full impact of what COVID will mean economically. We had issued a survey to over 1,000 people, and some of the results that we found were fairly shocking, but also expected. Half of all respondents had said that they had less than 3 months of savings available, and 3 out of 4 had less than 6 months. And our results, by the way, have been simulated with other surveys out there as well. I know Pew had very, very similar numbers. And just as a COVID month count, we are at 4 months since at least over here, and I believe like March 13th was like the big day when I started counting as the start of COVID on our side. So we're already past that 3 month mark. More interestingly, what we're starting to see is layoffs, not from the low income spectrum, but the middle income and higher income spectrum at this point. We just saw 1,000 employees be laid off on LinkedIn. We saw other more traditionally higher paid jobs getting laid off. So, with all of this in mind, we started asking again, okay, clearly you, the consumer, do not have enough liquid savings, your first mode that you access. So how can we help you build that? So if you can go to the next slide, the three simple things that the workers wanted was make saving something that's super easy for them, make it worthwhile for them to save, and everything else is really just a feature. So what does making it easy mean? Fundamentally, making it easy means it's a direct from paycheck contribution over to a savings account. You can have it be a deduction. You can have it any which way, but really it's money going directly from the paycheck into that liquid savings, that emergency fund that we would want. Making it worthwhile is something that's very interesting, because right now, if you try to go open a liquid savings account, some of your best savings accounts rates out there are maybe 1%. That's your high yield savings account. Maybe 1%, maybe just a little bit more than that. Reality is the national average is below 0.06%. So there's no economic incentive other than pure fear for people to save. So this is where, again, employers, this is where workers are starting to look to their employers to say, hey, can you make it worthwhile for me to put money away? Otherwise, they can just use debt as a way to achieve that liquidity. And we know the type of cycle that creates. Some of the other things that we found through talking with the consumers is different people do care about different things. For example, there's still a substantial population that care about opening a bank account. Like 3 out of 10 people care about opening an actual savings bank account. That's a pretty big number from our perspective. So these are some of the things that we've found. We also had one more insight, and this is, we don't have a graph on this, but we basically asked, okay, compared to some of the other financial benefits that are out there, where does emergency savings stack up? And of course, we didn't specifically ask it that way. We asked, what is your preference amongst these type of financial benefits, including insurance, including, of course, retirement savings. Surprisingly, emergency savings and personal savings came right after retirement savings and before college debt reduction, financial advisory services, and so on. And once you start drilling down based on the income segments, of course, you had your lower and more middle income groups state that. So hopefully this gives a bit of insight into what the consumer situation was at the start of April and what they were craving just as the crisis started unfolding. Katie, I'll kick it back over to you.
Yeah, it does, Sid. Thanks so much. And I think, when we look at this slide, certainly you look at the numbers in terms of, what people want, and 79% direct from paycheck, which, certainly leads to the logical conclusion that many people would probably welcome some help from their employer in this space. So, let's shift gears for a couple of minutes and talk about what employers might be doing in this space, as it relates to emergency savings. Do you feel that employers view it as their role to help with this? And I think, Sid and Barb, you probably have some really good insights in this space. So maybe Sid, I'll turn it back to you for a second to sort of share, the information on this page, and then ask Barb to weigh in as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So one thing that we've done really since the first survey is we started going back to the employer and specifically talking with HR leaders, benefits managers, essentially the decision maker, right, that would be making the purchasing decision about benefits, whether it's retirement savings or any type of other financial related decision there for their employees. You have a series of quotes over here, and I'm happy to. I believe the slides will be available, but I just want to highlight a couple of them. On the employer side, what we have found is that they are wanting to do something. Most of them want to do something, but they're looking for direction as to what that something is. They're looking for active solutions to be presented to them so that they can so the decision point becomes a lot easier for the employer. So one thing, I love the quote over here, which is, I think financial stress is a concern, but I don't know how to help people with that. So, there's so many types of solutions out there. Something that's a bit more tangible is something that I think employers are looking for. And I just want to add, on the worker side as well, quite often when we talk to someone that is not necessarily a decision maker, but let's just say someone off the street, there's this perception that the worker is not willing to save. We just saw the numbers say otherwise earlier. But it was absolutely surprising how many of them were pretty forthright with the specific solution that they wanted, which is they just want to be able to do direct from paycheck into a separate account. So with that, maybe I'll turn it over to you, Barb.
Yeah, thanks, Sid. Hopefully you all can hear me. If we can go to the next slide for a minute. So before I dig into some observations, I also want to just acknowledge what employers have done in the midst of the crisis. And there's kind of two things, the CARES Act response. And again, this is going to a survey of record keepers and what they saw people doing. And about half of plans were choosing to offer the coronavirus related loan. And about 3/4 actually have, at least at the time of the survey, adopted the coronavirus related distribution. So I think from that perspective, employers are doing something in the immediate to help give people access to money to help with that. Again, it's sad we have to rely on the 401k plan as the source of emergency savings, but employers are doing something. I also don't want to talk about what employers are doing without also acknowledge some other things they're doing that will impact the long-term security of folks. While not significant, we are seeing many employers are choosing, this is a different survey that we conducted, a pulse survey, but many employers are choosing to reduce or suspend or delay contributions to their retirement plan. Again, these all look like they're, at least the intent of them is temporary, but there's about 7% suspending, about 2% reducing, and about 2% delaying those contributions. So again, might be a short-term thing, hopefully is a short-term thing, but it will also have an impact on savings. So that's the background. I now want to say, when we look at what employers are doing today, this is a hot item. We've been measuring what employers are doing in sort of ancillary benefits, and about 12% of employers say they're doing something around emergency savings support. Now, I don't want you to get overexcited about that 12%. That could include credit unions or something. When we interview or talk to employers about what they may want to do, one survey showed like a lot are interested in doing something along these lines, but what it is may vary a lot by employer. We did do a recent employer survey that said 75% employers are interested in financial well-being, and when we asked them what are some of the top things they're doing in this space, interest in helping with day-to-day finances, which I would say emergency savings is part of that, was listed as a top 3 choice of about 70% of employers. And the only thing higher than that was actually creating a financial well-being strategy. So that's sort of the jumping point into doing all of this. So it's a very, when people are talking about financial well-being, I think helping with the day-to-day finances, including emergency savings, is a real priority. But then the question is, what does that look like? Sid gave us some great numbers that helped us understand this is something employees want, and I'd say I would concur that's what we're seeing. But when we look at support, it often is, again, education or resources is probably the priority where employers are thinking about doing something in this space. And so when I say resources, low-cost resources, not many employers, a very few are actually saying we want to help fund the emergency savings or fund something like that, but we do want to help get people better prepared for emergency savings. And when we look at the types of things people are doing, some of the resources, the resources could be both around creating emergency savings or finding short-term cash, right? So back to 1 in 20 are doing payday loans. Maybe employers are looking at the I can't quite remember what they call them, but the cash, you can get cash just in time and not have to wait for your paycheck. Those types of vendors. So day of pay, basically, which is less expensive than payday loans. So they're looking at things like that. Or access to emergency loans, those types of things. From the actual emergency savings, that's where we're seeing, again, I think Sid outlined so many things that are important, and how much of this can be done tied to the 401k, or is emergency savings an add-on to the 401k? That's where we're seeing some creativity, but also when we're in the 401k, there's some limits, and we have state laws and all kinds of stuff that might prevent some of those automatic deductions and things like that. So can they use the 401k? We are seeing people have after-tax savings in their 401k, which is a little more readily available, but there are restrictions around it. So it's not the perfect solution, but it is where we are seeing some employers go down that route to say, let's try and do something more in that arena. So with that, Katie, I think I'll turn it back.
Yeah, and you know what, Barb? Barb and Sid, we actually do have a couple of questions that I want to sort of go to now while we're on this topic. And so, Barb, I'll just keep it with you for a second.
Great.
So 2 questions. One is around reducing 401k contributions, sort of noting that, you know, it looks not that bad maybe compared to 2008, 2009. You know, is your perspective that that's true, or is the other shoe about to drop? So just, you know, any insights you have on that. I actually have a perspective on that too from Fidelity's perspective, but I'll pass to you first.
Yeah, so Katie, I'd love to hear your perspective. I think when I compare it to 2008, 2009, it's not that dissimilar in the numbers. And you got to remember, we're a little earlier in the process, right? I would say we're here right now. We saw some hesitancy. We have seen some uptick in the numbers. You know, at first when we were surveying, it was pretty low, right? Like we'd see more like 2%, but then it jumped up to 7%. I think the question is, where do employers go, right? Employers have been very active about looking for cost reductions, and it may depend a little on their strategy, right? Are they going to look at getting rid of workers, or are they going to looking at reducing cost and preserving workers, right? So we're seeing a broad array of strategies. I don't think, though, these numbers are all that dissimilar from 2008, knowing that it's one thing to look back and say how many people did it after it's kind of over versus what we're looking prospectively. So I don't see it as all that different. So I'd be curious if you do see that as significantly different.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that when, you know, and again, we've done a couple of polls of plan sponsors over the past few months, and the numbers really haven't changed that much. They're pretty consistent with what you have here on the slide in terms of how many employers have either suspended or reduced the match. It's roughly the same. The thing that I'll say that we've started asking over the past month or two, which is, do you have an active plan to reinstate? Because what we found in 08 and 09 is that the vast majority of employers that did reduce or suspend their match got it back. You know, they sort of reinstated it within a year. And what we're hearing from employers that are doing these things is that they do have an active sort of stated plan to, you know, reinstate within a year. Now, again, time will tell. We're in unprecedented times. Nobody knows what's going to happen, but I do think that it is pretty similar, you know, that it's sort of a temporary cost reduction, which actually is another question that came through for you, Barb, which is around temporary cost reductions, and are employers actively taking those? So maybe aside from, you know, the match, or are they expecting to do so? So I don't know if you have any additional thoughts on that.
Well, so there's kind of cost reductions across the board, right? Like in a lot of different areas of a business. But with respect to the retirement plans, these are mostly people who have acted. So we are monitoring who's announced a reduction, suspension. And Katie, similar to what you said, most of these have done something, but they also do not, for the vast majority, don't consider it permanent. I would say there's another thing that's happened in the meantime too, is employers have already offloaded a certain amount of retirement cost by getting rid of pensions, freezing them, closing them, settling them, things like that. So we've already seen commitments to retirement plans when you look at sort of the value going down over the last decade. And so I think maybe there's a little hesitancy to say if the DC plan is all you have, or could we get rid of it entirely, right? And again, I recognize that all employers had pension plans to begin with, but I just want to acknowledge there's already been a little tendency towards that. So I think most of this is temporary. I hope most of this is temporary, but it will depend on how we come out of it, right? Who can predict the future of the economic crisis we're in, right?
If we could, we'd have a lot more solid answers, right?
Exactly.
So Sid, just passing to you for a second. So thinking about sort of the consumer or the participant, a question came in around, do people just assume that they can borrow from family and friends if they need emergency money? But because those people are probably struggling right now, is this likely to result in further debt? And if some people just aren't good savers, which you had as a quote on your slide previously, are auto solutions the answer? So I'll let you sort of address those items.
Yeah, absolutely. So regarding the first two about the family and friends, something that we have found is that while the individual themselves may not have necessarily received a pay cut or a furlough or the worst case scenario of layoff, when you look at the household level, we've seen that 2/3 of all respondents had reported some form of a financial shock. So this idea that you can rely on the family and friends as your the first or second layer to tap in case something happens to you personally, that is also, as the question suggests, has come into disarray, and predominantly because everyone's kind of in the same boat, unless, of course, you were much better off with those liquid savings in the first place. So that's where we're starting to see people starting to rely more so on loans. The other thing to note, just as a brief thing here, is look, we for the people that have been laid off or on furlough, there has been the extra $600 per week up until really the end of this week, right? So I think the shoe will potentially drop depending on what the congressional action will be on that as well. So, whether that may be an uptick on hardship withdrawals on the 401k side, or to the point of this question, which is, will they start looking to family and friends and external network members to rely on them more? We'll start seeing those numbers a bit more, and we'll actually be conducting a survey in about 2 months, just 6 months after our initial one, to see how that plays out. The quote on the prior slide, sorry, Barb, did you want to hop in there real quick?
Well, I was going to just chime in on that one, Sid. I do think that's something I've thought about. We have had this stimulus that's helping people get by, right? So when we look at some of the numbers of how they've tapped into their 401k or other things, are those numbers going to escalate if they don't continue to get something? I think the reality is it could be. And I'd also say those numbers could even hide something else which is going on, which is when people lose their jobs because of the pandemic, are they taking the money out? Which Jack alluded to in the first panel, that we do see this huge leakage problem. So even if we look at how they're tapping into their savings, we don't want to forget that people losing their jobs are likely to really tap into their savings.
And if I could also jump in here, this is Catherine. AARP has also surveyed folks about unexpected financial challenges of the general public, and we've found that there is a hierarchy of levers that people pull, of course, cutting back on expenses, and then doing the more extreme things, such as borrowing from long-term investments if they're fortunate enough to have them. Family and friends is an interesting one, and I don't want to lose this theme throughout. Looking at a savings balance objectively as the sole measure of someone's financial resilience is, of course, in part imperfect. And so I want us to keep that in mind as we look at overall financial well-being. And we've learned over the years, especially from communities of color and consumers of color, who say that family and friends networks are so important and just don't show up in the balance sheet. However, in a crisis like this, when everyone is under duress, those networks really do are also subsequently under stress. And I think that's an important thing to recognize, that the ripple effects of it are going to be potentially hidden by many of the indicators, the imperfect indicators that we need to use to look at the damage done.
Absolutely. If I can just finish out one quick answer on the auto savers or good savers piece. The good savers comment, I just wanted to make sure that we were providing perspective from all employers. We do have some employers bringing that up, right? Like just because they believe that someone is isn't a good saver shouldn't necessarily be the decision making point on whether they offer the solution itself. So that is something that is a barrier, that is an education barrier within the HR leader level as well. And I think that's really a responsibility for record keepers and solution providers such as ourselves to help educate that, look, the consumer is willing. So sorry about that, Katie, I'll turn it back over to you.
No, that's okay. Thank you so much. Before we move on to the next question, we wanted to take a minute, if we can, invite everybody to participate in a quick poll. So, thinking about the employer, do you believe it's the employer's responsibility to facilitate emergency savings? So I think that the question will come right up, and you can see some options here. Yes, most are actively incorporating solutions. Yes, but only a few are actively incorporating solutions. No, most see it as outside of the scope of their responsibility, or you're not sure or don't know. So if you could just take 30 or so seconds to respond to the poll, we'll take a look at the results. Okay, I think that the results of the poll can be popped up. Okay, so I love the Jeopardy theme. Thank you. I mentioned to the panelists yesterday that if you don't watch Jeopardy, you should this week, because they are doing a throwback, and you can take a look at 1980s Jeopardy. But let's take a look at the results of the poll here. Looks like about 50% said yes, but few are actively incorporating solutions. So I think that's pretty consistent with some of the thoughts that I had here. 36% see it as outside of the scope of their responsibility. Small percent are actively incorporating solutions, and then about 11% don't know. So thank you for taking the time to do that. Let's shift gears a little bit and we've talked about individual consumers, we've talked about employers. Let's switch focus to policymakers here. So Catherine, I'd love to ask you to lead off in terms of, is the system actually broken when it comes to emergency savings, and what can policymakers do to help? So Catherine, I'll ask you to sort of lead us off here.
Sure. So I'm glad to see the poll results. I see this as progress, that folks think that employers see emergency savings as part of their responsibility, or at least facilitating emergency savings. This has been a concept that has been in the ether for a number of years now, and it is really being brought to the fore, even pre-COVID, by some of the disruptions in productivity, in the rise in financial stress and how it plays out in the workplace. And so employers are beginning to recognize that. And of course, I think these early indicators of the use of 401ks to cover expenses and financial hardship related to COVID, that's just a sign of an underlying lack of liquidity. So the fact that consumers are willing to pay the penalties in some cases prior to COVID, or in this case are willing to, in essence, eat their seed corn by dipping into long-term savings, is really not the fault of consumers so much as a lack of options. So instead of really blaming or shaming consumers for not having saved a liquid savings cushion, what we really need to do is we need to create the conditions and the systems to facilitate savings, and can actually be pretty low cost to do in the workplace. So AARP, along with a number of other thought leaders, including EBRI, the National Bureau of Economic Research, Aspen Institute, and others, we've been looking at several models of payroll deduction emergency savings programs. And what this does is it gets at the demand by consumers, which you can see on the screen here, our most recent polling, for saving at the point of pay, saving directly out of the paycheck. We surveyed the public 2 years ago around whether they would be interested in a payroll deduction emergency savings program. And we found that 71% of people who were paid by direct deposit would be interested. And so we see that point of pay as a really important moment in terms of a psychological way to sweep money aside before it hits your bank account in your spend account, so to speak. So there's some mental accounting principles that help people maintain their savings goals by using a payroll deduction emergency savings program. But a critical component of that the field is really embracing for emergency savings programs to work well is automatically enrolling participants. And so all of the experts on the call here today who are coming from the retirement space are very familiar with the benefits of automatic enrollment, doubling in some cases new hire participation in savings programs. So creating conditions under which people can save through automatic enrollment is so important. And if you switch to the next slide, there's a model that AARP, we're about to publish a paper on this in a couple of weeks, where employers can actually facilitate payroll deduction emergency savings programs via a card. It's actually using a payroll card, but just as the destination for a small portion of emergency savings. The benefits of a plan like this, a program like this, is that it's low cost to the employer. It gives people access to their money right away, which we heard from consumers is, of course, the top most important feature of an emergency savings program is having that liquidity when you need it. It's familiar to people. They're used to being able to swipe a card for transactions or for bill pay. And it doesn't have any oversight in terms of privacy or knowledge or insider knowledge on the part of the employer into how the card is being used. So we really want to trust consumers that they're going to determine what an emergency means to them, that it's not the employer's responsibility, it's not the provider's responsibility, that just having that liquid savings cushion separate and apart from their regular account is going to be enough of a buffer and a barrier that they will use it for that purpose. Most importantly, though, the model that I have up on the screen here, which we're dubbing a savings card, is that it operates by using a payroll card, which is a form of a prepaid card regulated by the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. It operates under a federal regulatory regime that's very favorable to automatic enrollment. And just last week, at the end of last week, there was an announcement from CFPB that they're now accepting applications under a template application from employers who want to test out automatic enrollment emergency savings programs using payroll deduction. They will essentially do no action for employers who apply for the program successfully to be able to try this out, because so many of us have this hypothesis that we're going to be able to see high participation, safe savings for employees, and accessible savings over time by removing some of the regulatory barriers that we think have been holding employers back, or regulatory uncertainty really, that have been holding employers back from really embracing auto enrollment in these kinds of programs. So I will stop there. I know that Sid has some other and some similar perspectives on what it's going to take. So happy to look forward to that conversation.
He does.
Sure, absolutely. I would like to just quickly add on that. So definitely autosave feature is the starting point. And no matter what, that's where all of us need to immediately focus. That is the very first hypothesis to test. And Regulation E is from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That is, I'm very happy to see that they have cast out that template. One other piece from a policy maker standpoint that would be really helpful is on the matching side, specifically on the payroll taxes side for employers. Because all of this happens post-tax, employers would have to pay payroll taxes on any matches that go into a liquid or an accessible savings account. So if that is, quite frankly, from most employer standpoint, more so annoying than anything else. It's an administrative burden than anything else. And the amount of revenue that is gained versus what is possible if we can even have that small cash incentive in place, I think it becomes a no-brainer that the government, and this is more so from a congressional action, would incentivize or at least not necessarily tax actively the incremental match there. So I think I'll just throw that additional piece out there.
Right, and I think that goes back to setting up the incentives for people to save. I mean, we have a pre-tax incentive for retirement savings. We have all sorts of tax incentives for businesses and for long-term investments, and just nothing compares to it for liquid savings.
Great. We just have about 3 minutes left in this session, but I have seen a few questions come in. So just want to take maybe a minute or two to get to those. So the first, Catherine, I think this one is for you here. Has anyone explored the use of automatic enrollment with deemed IRAs?
Yes.
Deemed IRA regulations specifically confirm that automatic enrollment is possible. So I'll pass that to you, or if anybody else wants to weigh in.
Yes, and I can put in the chat here a link to the paper if anyone's interested. But there's essentially two ways to go about setting up a payroll deduction emergency savings program. One is within a retirement savings plan and could take advantage of something like a deemed IRA or an after-tax 401k. The other, where the regulation around auto enrollment isn't explicitly prohibited, but also is a little more uncertain, is outside the retirement plan. But indeed, there's a long technical paper from NBER that goes into the various options for deemed IRAs. The downside of those, of course, is the tax implications and just how long it takes for the money to hit the bank, or really to hit the employee's account. If you have a flat tire this morning and you need to get to work, you can't wait for an ACH or a 7-day or a 72-hour transfer.
Yeah. And then what is the name of the entity who is soliciting employers who want to trial the savings card?
It's the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, CFPB.
Great. Okay, well, I think it's always a good thing when you run out of time here, and we're right up on time. We could probably, again, like the first session, talk for much longer about this topic, but at this point, I'd like to thank Catherine, Sid, and Barb for a great conversation and all the questions that came in. And Lori, I'll pass it back to you. I think we're heading into a little break here.
Yes, we are. Thank you, Katie, and thank you so much, everyone, for that great conversation. It's been an amazing morning so far, and with really important insights about things like the role of the family and friends in meeting emergency savings needs, the futility of trying to shame people into saving, and a growing consensus of the role of the employer in helping workers with their emergency savings needs. And just a reminder to everyone, we are recording the session, so if you have colleagues or others that you would like to link this over to, we'll post this on the website and in our newsletter tomorrow, and give you an opportunity to listen to these sessions again. We are going into a break, but I want to urge everyone to be back here promptly at 11:05 Eastern Time. We have a really impressive array of panelists for our next panel as well, caregiving and COVID-19. It's a really hot topic, and so please be prompt in coming back here, and we'll give you a few minutes of break, and after that also we'll have the partner update. So we'll see you soon. Update. And just to let you know again,